pomp was every bit an equal part of Nazism as anti-Semitism, and we don't mean that in jest, as a huge part of Nazism was creating a new mythology for a new Germany. And every good myth needs its heroes, doesn't it? So consequently, the Nazis gave out medals and awards for everything as they worked to foster the new breed of heroic and obedient Germans. And we do mean everything. Consider as examples the Cross of Honour of the German Mother, which rewarded women who pumped out a high number of kids, and the SA Sports Badge, which was awarded to soldiers who demonstrated high and consistent physical prowess. But while examples such as those can be fascinating for their bizarre banality, they aren't exactly what you would call rare, with 4.7 million and 2.5 million having been awarded respectively. If you want something less banal, and much rarer, how about this? The ever so snappily named 20th of July 1944 Wound Badge, which was awarded to a mere 24 people, to commemorate their presence during an explosive attempt on the life of none other than Adolf Hitler himself. Interested? Then don't go anywhere. We'll tell you all about it. The 20th of July Wound Badge was a variation of a far more common award, that simply being the normal Wound Badge, which actually significantly predated the Nazis' rise to power, having originally been instituted by Kaiser Wilhelm II on the 3rd of March 1918 during the final arc of World War I. As you've no doubt ascertained by its name, the purpose of the award was to recognise and honour soldiers that had been wounded or maimed in the line of duty, giving them both a formal pat on the back from the Kaiser for their efforts and a little something something that they could wear to soak up some kudos from their fellow soldiers. It was also a progressive award, with it being dished out in 3 separate grades that represented a greater number of injuries as having been sustained by the recipient. First was black, a colour that was chosen to represent iron in an echo of the far more famous Iron Cross medal. To earn one of these, a soldier had to be wounded once or twice. Then there was silver for those who had been wounded 3 or 4 times, and then finally there was gold for those who had been injured 5 or more times. And as you've seen on the screen multiple times by now, its design was a relatively simple thing. A Stahlhelm, by then an iconic symbol of the German military, accompanied by the very martial imagery of a couple of crossed swords and a wreath. Hitler himself earned one of them, specifically in black, for an injury he sustained on the 15th of October 1918. It happened while he was at a field kitchen just outside of Ypres getting his scran for the evening. There, the British started pounding the area with long-range gas munitions, and Hitler dallied in getting his respirator on, with some historians even suggesting that the delay was caused by him attempting to wolf down his tea before locking his gullet away behind the thick and impenetrable leather of the mask. Whatever caused it, the delay wasn't sufficient to expose Hitler to anything like a lethal dosage, but it was enough to cause him to wake up with eyes that absolutely burnt the next day. As per then long well-established protocol, Hitler and the other exposed soldiers in the area began shuffling off in a single file, hands on each other's soldiers, towards the nearest first aid post, during the course of which Hitler lost all vision and went totally blind. He was then formally diagnosed with mustard gas poisoning and sent back to Germany to recover, which indeed he did soon enough. Interestingly, in Mein Kampf, he claimed that he was in hospital recovering from these wounds when Germany's defeat was formally declared, which made him go temporarily blind once again. But as Mein Kampf isn't exactly what you would call a reliable historical document, we'd probably suggest that you take that particular claim with a grain of salt. Following the end of World War I, the Wound Badge was put on ice, although it's unclear whether or not this was the result of a formal declaration from the top, as it were, or whether it simply got overlooked and forgotten about in the chaos of the Weimar period. Indeed, so quickly did it fall by the wayside that not even everyone who was entitled to one from World War I ended up receiving one, a situation which was later remedied after the Nazis came to power, as in January 1936, Hitler, via the Ministry of the Interior, issued a declaration stating that all who had failed to receive their World War I earned Wound Badge would now have an official channel to do so, as well as receive the necessary paperwork to prove their right to wear it. In the same spirit too, the right to wear it was also extended to veterans of the Austro-Hungarian army in April 1939, following the successful annexations of Austria and the Czech half of Czechoslovakia. As for when the new ones were issued, that would be in May 1939, when the award was formally reintroduced for injured veterans of the Condor Legion, Germany's expeditionary force to the Spanish Civil War, which had ended the month prior. That decision was a bit of a last-minute one too, meaning that they didn't have enough time to produce new dies for a specifically Nazi version, and so the old ones were pulled out of the warehouse, given a big old swastika on top of them, and it was called a day. As the Condor Legion was a touch on the small side, however, hardly any of these were actually awarded, with only 182 black badges and a single silver badge being dished out. Come the onset of World War II, a few months later, however, new dies had been made to fully Nazify the award, and they were being churned out of the factory by the truckful in anticipation of what was to come, with 24 manufacturers in total being contracted for the task. As for what the new badges look like, behold, as you can see across all grades, it's basically exactly the same, just with the Stahlhelm updated to now show the slimline new M1935 model rather than the giant bucket that was its World War I forerunner. And of course, can't forget the swastika, which they kept as per the Spanish Civil War version. The award criteria was also kept exactly the same, at least on paper, as a commander could use their discretion to award a higher grade if the injuries sustained had been particularly nasty, like the loss of a limb, eyesight, or one's meat and two veg being common ways of getting bumped up. And since this was the World War II award, i.e. the one we are actually interested in today, let's take a look at how they were made. To begin with, they were all made out of brass and then had something else bunged over the top to give them their final colour. For the black award, this was just a coat of paint, whereas for silver and gold, they were properly plated in the corresponding metal. This changed in time, however, as brass is quite the precious material, particularly when you are facing a total naval blockade and have two separate air forces attempting to bomb you back to the Stone Age in any day that lends with the letter Y. Therefore, in time, zinc was utilised as a substitute, with the plating just being replaced with a whitewash and a gilt wash on the silver and gold awards, respectively. So that's all fun and games then. If you get f***ed up fighting for the fatherland, you get one of 3 lovely little badges from the Führer as a pat on the back, and the later you got given it, the quality it was. You might have heard, however, that World War II wasn't a particularly pleasant experience for anyone involved. So unpleasant, in fact, that come the end of the war in Europe, around 5 million wound badges had been dished out. So the wound badge isn't exactly what you would call rare. That naturally gets the mind wondering, doesn't it? If being royally mangled to the point of only being alive in the most abstract sense of the word only got you a gold award, how bad was the assassination attempt on Hitler that a whole new extra special award had to be implemented? Well, let's move on and find out. Otherwise known as Operation Valkyrie, the 20th of July plot had its roots in a growing dissatisfaction amongst Germany's military elite and intellectual circles that went back as early as the late 1930s. Even by that time, some recognised that Hitler's policies were leading the country towards disaster, with great examples being General Ludwig Beck, who resigned in 1938 in protest of Hitler's aggressive expansion, and Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, who criticised Hitler for his dismantling of democracy, wanton military spending that the nation could ill afford, and, despite not exactly being a Zionist himself, the horrific crimes he was sanctioning against Germany's Jewish population. Once catastrophic military disasters started piling up, with failing to invade the UK, being kicked out of North Africa, and getting creamed in Stalingrad being key examples, anti-Hitler sentiments, which had been remarkably scant before the war, started to percolate within the ranks of the German elite, and when it became blatantly apparent that Hitler was not, nor would ever, consider surrendering, those who were so minded quickly surmised that there was only one way that Germany was getting out of its current mess without being completely reduced to rubble and with some segments of dignity intact. Hitler had to be killed. Power had to be seized. Leading Nazis had to be purged. And then a surrender with the Allies had to be negotiated. And so, soon enough, a conspiracy to do so began to form. The linchpin member of the conspiracy was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a highly decorated veteran of the Polish, French, Soviet and North African campaigns. Ironically, he had also earned himself a wound badge in gold, no less, as in April 1943, while serving in North Africa, a British P-40 Kitty Hawk had spotted his car moving through the desert and decided to dive down and give it the business. And thanks to this, von Stauffenberg lost his left eye, his entire right hand and 2 fingers on the other one. Despite this, this, he remained committed to his duties with the Wehrmacht, at least initially, but over time a little niggle of doubt started to burrow its way into its mind. From there, with said niggling proving to be fast digging indeed, it wasn't long until he became fully convinced that Hitler had to be removed, after which he identified and made contact with similarly minded members of Germany's military elite. Come mid-1944, he had found himself the leader of the anti-Hitler faction, and so the burden of planning fell to him. Eventually, however, he settled upon an ingenious plan to take advantage of Operation Valkyrie, an already existing Nazi government plan for maintaining control in the event of internal unrest or the collapse of law and order. As for what it entailed, it called for army units to be mobilized and deployed to seize control of all government buildings, communication hubs, and critical infrastructure. All the actually important stuff, basically, so that the country could still, more or less, keep running no matter how bad the domestic situation got. This also gave Stauffenberg the beginnings of his assassination plan. If he killed Hitler and blamed it on some of the loyalist party elites, he could deal with Hitler, seize power, and get the jump on the loyalists, all in a way that would look genuine and above board to the wider German populace. As for the first part of the conspiracy, the killing Hitler part, Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators put their minds to the matter and eventually came up with a devilishly simple plan. When Hitler attended an upcoming military briefing at the Wolf's Lair, his Eastern Front headquarters in occupied Poland, they would hide 2 timer-delayed bombs in a suitcase and subtly put them near Hitler. Then they'd get out of there double quick, Hitler would be smeared against the wall, they'd launch Operation Valkyrie, purge the senior Nazis, negotiate a peace, and happy days. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way. The burden of placing the bombs fell to Stauffenberg himself, as he had just been made Chief of Staff to General Friedrich Fromm, the commander of the Reserve Army, and so had full permission to attend the briefing. So far, so good. But in his rush to prepare, and out of a fear of getting caught, Stauffenberg only managed to arm 1 of the bombs. This wasn't a problem, Stauffenberg reasoned, as he still managed to drop them off very close to Hitler, easily close enough so that 1 bomb alone would still be more than adequate. Little did he know, however, that when he got out of there, with the pretense of having to take a phone call, his suitcase was then moved by Colonel Heinz Brandt to get it out of everyone's way and placed it underneath a table behind its leg. And this table happened to be made out of very, very solid oak. And we think you can all tell where this is going. The bomb detonated at exactly 12:42 p.m. and sure enough, it did indeed cause an enormous explosion that decimated the room, except for the bit where Hitler had been stood, as the aforementioned beefy table leg had absorbed and deflected much of the blast, and so Hitler was still alive and well, no worse for wears, save for temporary deafness, some very slight burns, and brown stains in his underpants. Not that Stauffenberg knew that, mind you. As far as he was aware, Hitler was dead, and so he returned to Berlin to initiate Operation Valkyrie. Soon after its launch, however, word soon began to spread that Hitler was in fact alive and kicking, and the enlisted men and junior officers on the bottom, all of whom were totally in the dark about the conspiracy and were just following orders, all began to get confused and start doubting their actions. As for the senior officers commanding them, who had been active conspirators, they all began to distance themselves, or even just flatly go to the Gestapo, finger-a-pointing in the hopes of surviving the coming retribution. By the evenings of the 20th of July, the coup had completely collapsed. It hadn't even managed to last a day. Hitler, naturally, wasn't exactly chuffed about this attempt on his life, as were powerful Nazi loyalists, and so the reprisal against the conspirators was swift and brutal, with Stauffenberg and several of his co-conspirators all being arrested and executed on the very same day of the coup. Others, such as General Ludwig Beck and Colonel General Erich Hoppner and Major General Henning von Treschow, would all share the same fate in the coming days. When all was said and done, a few weeks later, just shy of 5,000 people had been executed for confirmed or suspected involvement in the plot. And that brings us back to the matter of wound badges, because while the nature of the injuries sustained by those in the room were more than covered by the normal badge, the event itself had been so momentous that Hitler decreed that a whole new variation of the award was needed to reflect that fact, and of course, what he settled on was the wound badge of the 20th of July 1944. So let's now move on and have a look at that medal itself. As you can see, it's basically just a normal wound badge, but zhuzhed up a bit. For starters, the helmet is slightly higher up and larger than on a normal award, with the extra space being given to both a commemoration of the date for which it was being awarded and a facsimile of Hitler's signature. Also, because it is kind of hard to tell from the pictures, what with them being 80 years old now, whereas the normal wound badges by this point in the war made out of cheap, crappy zinc, these ones had no expense spared on them, being made from pure, solid silver and constructed entirely by hand. It also came in the same 3 grades, with the way it was awarded being add a wound to whatever you've already got, then make whatever colour that would otherwise be one of these posh new ones, with future wounds sustained eventually being able to turn into higher grades of the 20th of July badge. It also came in a rather fancy silk-covered presentation box, which is notable because by this point in the war, normal wound badges were generally supplied in a simple paper sleeve, their presentation boxes having long since been done away with to save on materials. All in all, 100 of them were made, with only 24 of them actually being awarded, as we've already mentioned. 4 of the awards were posthumous, specifically for stenographer Heinrich Berger, Colonel Heinz Brandt, Lieutenant General Rudolf Schmundt, and General of the Air Force Günther Korten, with their awards being personally presented to their families by Hitler himself not long after its inception. As for the living awardees, we think you'd get a touch bored if we rattled through a bullet point list of 20 names, so we'll stick it on the screen for you while we carry on. All of these men received their award in a large and lavish ceremony headed by Hitler on the 2nd of September 1944. But interestingly, he didn't award one for himself, despite the fact that since the bombing wasn't exactly great for his health, he was legitimately entitled to one. Why he didn't do this remains a mystery, but whatever the reason, it was a peculiar choice because while he wasn't one to bling himself up with medals and awards he didn't earn, he did wear the ones he had earned legitimately, and he wore them very proudly indeed. And that pretty much is all there is to discuss on the matter. The medal itself is, after all, just a fancy version of the normal wound badge. And given that we've discussed the story that prompted its implementation, its physical appearance, and the amount that got awarded it, that's really all there is to say. So we'll call it a day there.